Part of the fun of watching Star Wars is finding new orders to watch the movies in. I mean, it's kind of unique in that way. Do you watch it in release order or chronological order or some weird custom order? Like I said, it's unique to Star Wars. Nobody's running around debating what order to watch the Lord of the Rings in, or the Star Trek films, or the MCU films for that matter. Now, the viewing order changes your perspective. That's why Star Wars fans love doing it so much. And it's fitting because a person's point of view is one of the series' minor themes.
So what I told you was true, from a certain point of view.
A certain point of view?
Luke, you're going to find that many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view.
Sin is evil! From my point of view, the Jedi are evil!
At any rate, you've probably heard of Machete Order, which goes A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith, Return of the Jedi, Force Awakens, Last Jedi, Rise of Skywalker. It just uses the latter two films of the prequel trilogy as a flashback. It keeps the standalone chapters out like Rogue One and Solo, which is fine, but there's a glaring omission in Machete Order, which is episode 1. And for many people, well, that's the beauty of it, because a criticism leveled against The Phantom Menace is how self-contained it feels, and that it's better to use episode 2 as your landing pad into the prequels. After all, old Ben doesn't mention Qui-Gon Jinn or Naboo or the Trade Federation when he's talking to Luke, so why even feature them, right? Well, I feel like that kind of misses the point of episode 1. Now, there were a few marks that George Lucas fell short of when he was making the prequels.
They've knocked out all our communications.
You are in my very soul.
I don't want this stunted slime in my sight again.
But he tended to have a firm grasp on themes and parallels to the real world. The Phantom Menace is arguably the most theme-heavy and thoughtful of the prequels. Taking a jaunt to the other end of the space genre, Prometheus makes a statement that fits pretty well here. It's when David the android observes, "Big things come from small beginnings." And that's really the thesis of The Phantom Menace. This big epic saga was born out of something relatively inconsequential. A trade dispute of all things. And it serves as a warning for us not to ignore seemingly insignificant events in our world, lest they grow into real monsters. One of those monsters is tyranny. Emperor Palpatine's rise to power is meant to mirror the fall of democracy in pre-World War II Germany. Oftentimes, a crisis, manufactured or not, is the catalyst for either strong action or the installation of strong leaders. We don't know a ton about Sheev Palpatine. Even less now with his backstory novel Plagueis relegated to legends, but frankly, he does have a movie. The Phantom Menace is a Palpatine film. It's just seen through the eyes of the Jedi and Queen Amidala. Heck, his own theme plays over the final scene of the movie. It's played in a major key instead of a minor one because it's his party. He's won. Our hero's victory is a false one because Palpatine has gotten exactly what he's wanted. The treaty meant to make the siege of Naboo by the Trade Federation legal ultimately didn't matter because it was the perception of Senate weakness that Palpatine wanted anyway, and achieved very quickly. So, since Palpatine is the ultimate villain of the saga, the movie that centers around the origin of his machinations really can't be left out. And that would be enough in of itself, but it also foreshadows Order 66, if you can believe it. Next to Darth Maul and maybe Jar Jar Binks, the battle droid was the defining image to come out of Episode 1 at the time. It was our new stormtrooper. And it became so, not just so we could see some kid-friendly dismemberment. The Trade Federation droid army fit into Lucas's ultimate thematic plans.
When we have the attack of the droids here, it was important to establish these droids as slightly goofy rather than ominous, and not very good shots, and they have absolutely no defense against a Jedi and a laser sword. They're just hopeless. So the idea was that as we go on, that the problem of developing better combat technology is established in this movie, and then it will be dealt with further in Episode 2. The failings of a robotic army in terms of their all being controlled by one source and not being as swift as a human is a theme that would play out through all the movies.
And that was recorded for the DVD commentary at the time. That theme would be gestured to again twice in Attack of the Clones.
Well, if droids could think, There'd be none of us here, would there?
You will find that they are immensely superior to droids.
The problem with battle droids is they're too dependent and reliant on control ships and programming. The story of Order 66 is more than just one scene in Episode 3. It's woven into the whole trilogy starting from the first chapter.
At last we will have revenge.
The prequel trilogy shows how the galaxy goes from armies of droids that can't think for themselves to an army of flesh and blood soldiers taken from the populace to subjugate itself. And then you have the Trade Federation's own theme playing over our introduction to the Clone Army in Episode 2. This was not a cut and paste job from Episode's 1 soundtrack. It was a brand new recording in the studio, so it was a deliberate choice. This is a droid army in all but composition. They're manufactured on an assembly line, they're programmed to be obedient, and they lack individual identities, which would later be corrected in the Clone Wars series. Further, Episode 1 strongly carries the theme of symbionts. Obi-Wan spells it out to Boss Nass. You and the Naboo form a symbiote circle. What happens to one of you will affect the other. You must understand this. Qui-Gon uses the same word when Anakin asks about midichlorians. We are symbionts with them. Life forms living together for mutual advantage. And this lends itself to the previous theme of big things having small beginnings. The literal microscopic midichlorians have a massive effect on the greater universe and are responsible for the entire saga. The point is, Episode 1 may not directly lead into the next chapter like Marvel has conditioned audiences to believe it does, but it does show the initial stones cast into the water that ripple out for a century or more in story time. It also shows the beginning world state and what is lost when the Republic burns away and rises as the Empire.
So this is how Liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
Honestly, if there's any movie you can skip from the prequels, it's probably Attack of the Clones. When you think about it, it does not fill you in on anything you can't glean by jumping straight into Episode 3 from 1. Starting Revenge of the Sith, all we really need to know is the galaxy is at war with separatists. And you can tell that from the opening crawl. The reason for war is made clear just by the word separatist. You also only need to know that Anakin and Padme are secretly married, which you can tell when they first meet up and she reveals she's pregnant. You don't have to know it's a secret because of the Jedi Code. She's a public figure and he's in no position to raise a child with his obligations.
Soon I will have a new apprentice, one far younger and more powerful.
You also need to know Palpatine has been mentoring Anakin, and there are plenty of scenes showing this, and they just reinforce what Episode 2 laid down. You can tell they have a close relationship.
Remember what you told me about your mother and the Sand People?
What do we avoid by skipping Attack of the Clones? Well, we skip Anakin and Padme's fairly awkward romance.
No.
By jumping from them as kids with a close bond to married adults, we get to create a better romance in our head. We can assume they took the last 13 years to grow a natural romantic bond. We skip the origin of the clone army. The template for this massive clone army, which showed up out of nowhere at just the right time, was an associate of the separatist leader Count Dooku. Sure, Jango Fett was a bounty hunter and it may very well have been an unrelated job like any other, but no reasonable person would assume that right off the bat. We also skip Anakin and Obi-Wan's strained relationship. Old Ben called Luke Skywalker's father a cunning warrior and a good friend, and this is definitely not what we see, for the most part, in Attack of the Clones. We get a scene here or there of them sharing a moment, but overall it's a fairly acrimonious relationship, which yes is by design since Obi-Wan is meant to be Anakin's father figure, but I'd argue the film overplays its hand in this regard. We also skip Count Dooku for the most part. Now this isn't really a glaring flaw so much as fat that can be trimmed. Because for being a central antagonist of Episode 2, Dooku isn't that much of a critical player. He shows up late in Episode 2 and leaves really early in Episode 3. His personal connection to Yoda and Obi-Wan is never taken advantage of to the full. so it doesn't matter if we never hear it. All we need to know is he's a bad guy in the Confederacy and he is Sidious's new apprentice. We also don't need to see how Palpatine is bestowed with this emergency powers. It's cool enough to see, don't get me wrong, but Obi-Wan's line about him staying in office long after his term has expired gets the job done. Plus, manipulating Jar Jar Binks in the blunt way that they do takes away from the mythos just a tad.
It's a clear these separatists made a pact. We said these are Federation betrayed.
Part of the fun of being an editor is seeing how cutting something differently changes the whole thing. And dumping episode 1 changes more than you may initially think. It's full of lore that's important to the story, it's full of themes that carry on throughout the saga. It ends up being a heck of an introduction to our big baddie of the whole saga, and I think it just kicks things off right. It's hard to cut it out entirely because big things do have small beginnings. And speaking of small beginnings, thanks for watching. This is my debut video and I sincerely hope you've enjoyed it. If you can do me a huge favor, just leave a like and subscribe. It's free and it helps me out a ton. Leave a comment on what you'd like to see from this channel. You kind of have a chance to shape it because it's so early. And you can start by leaving a comment answering the question, which episode of the saga would you leave out? For now, stay tough and stop by again sometime.